Burkina Faso, a land of resilience and strength, is at the center of a powerful transformation. And at the heart of it all is one name that's shaking the foundations of France's influence in Africa: Ibrahim Traoré. But why is France, a country that has maintained control over much of Africa for centuries, so afraid of this young military leader? Today, we dive deep into the geopolitical battle brewing in the Sahel, as Traoré challenges the very power structure that has kept Africa under the thumb of colonial forces for generations. What does his rise mean for France, for Africa, and for the world? Stay with us as we break down the incredible story of defiance, sovereignty, and the bold struggle for freedom that's making waves across the globe. This is the story of why France is afraid of Ibrahim Traoré. Ibrahim Traoré is not just a name. He's becoming a symbol of defiance, hope, and the unyielding spirit of resistance in Africa. In a world where African nations have often been subjected to the whims of foreign powers, Traoré stands as a beacon of hope for those who believe in the power of self-determination. This young leader, at just 34 years old, is challenging the status quo, rewriting the narrative of what it means to be an African leader in the 21st century. But who is Ibrahim Traoré, really? To understand the magnitude of his rise, we must look beyond the headlines and delve deeper into the man behind the movement. Ibrahim Traoré's journey to the forefront of Burkina Faso's political landscape is a story of resilience and ambition. Born in the heart of West Africa, Traoré grew up in a region marked by both incredible challenges and profound potential. Burkina Faso, a country rich in natural resources, has long been plagued by political instability, economic hardship, and external interference from foreign powers. In September 2022, Ibrahim Traoré rose to prominence in one of the most significant events in Burkina Faso's recent history: a military coup that overthrew the government. This was not a spontaneous act. It was the culmination of years of frustration, a response to the systemic failures that had gripped the country. The previous administration had struggled to address the growing threat of jihadist insurgencies in the Sahel region, and the people of Burkina Faso were left vulnerable, abandoned by both their leaders and the international community. Traoré saw this as an opportunity, a moment to take control of his country's destiny. Unlike many of his predecessors, Ibrahim Traoré did not take power for personal gain or to perpetuate the status quo. His vision was different, rooted in the belief that Africa, and especially Burkina Faso, deserved to control its own future. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso is striving to break free from the chains of neo-colonialism, the remnants of the colonial powers that have long exploited African nations for their resources, labor, and wealth. In particular, Traoré has been vocal in his opposition to France's long-standing military presence in West Africa, which many view as a modern form of imperialism. But Traoré's rise is not just about rejecting foreign interference. It's about empowering the people of Burkina Faso. His leadership is about giving voice to the voiceless and restoring dignity to a nation that has long been marginalized on the global stage. His bold decisions, including the expulsion of French troops from the country, were acts of sovereignty. These were powerful statements that Burkina Faso was reclaiming control over its own future. In his words, Burkina Faso will no longer bow to foreign interests. We are reclaiming our sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership is particularly significant because it represents a generational shift in the way African leaders approach governance. For too long, African nations have been subjected to the influence of former colonial powers, and many of their leaders have been unable or unwilling to break free from these ties. Traoré is different. He represents a new breed of African leaders who are not afraid to challenge the old guard, who are willing to fight for their countries, to stand on their own 2 feet, and who refuse to allow the legacies of colonization to define their nations. It's important to remember that Traoré's leadership doesn't exist in a vacuum. His rise to power comes at a time when Africa and specifically the Sahel region, is at a crossroads. The threat of extremism and terrorism in the region has been exacerbated by the presence of foreign military forces, which many argue have failed to provide the stability they promised. Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, is grappling with an ongoing crisis, with thousands of lives lost and millions displaced. For many, Traoré represents not just a military leader, but a voice for those who have suffered in silence for too long. Through his leadership, Traoré is tapping into something much larger than just the political landscape of Burkina Faso. He's tapping into the collective consciousness of Africa. He's becoming a symbol of a movement that is sweeping across the continent, one that is rejecting the shackles of foreign control and demanding the right to self-determination. His actions inspire a new generation of Africans who are ready to stand up, speak out, and fight for a better future. It's easy to look at Ibrahim Traoré and dismiss him as just another military leader, but that would be a mistake. Traoré is not just fighting for political power. He's fighting for justice, for sovereignty, and for the future of Africa. His story is one of resilience against all odds, of refusing to accept a fate dictated by outside forces. He is proving that age, experience, or the weight of history are not barriers to greatness. His rise to power is a powerful reminder that even in the face of adversity, one person can change the course of history. In the face of overwhelming odds, Ibrahim Traoré has become the embodiment of what it means to lead with purpose. His leadership shows us that true power comes not from military strength or political maneuvering, but from the courage to stand up for what is right and to fight for the future we believe in. Traoré's rise is proof that Africa is not just a continent of poverty and struggle. It is a continent of potential, of strength, and of leaders who are ready to take their place on the world stage. The legacy of French influence in Africa is a complex, deeply embedded history that stretches back centuries. It is a story of conquest, domination, and, ultimately, resistance. For more than 150 years, France ruled over vast swaths of West and Central Africa, establishing an empire that spanned multiple nations, from Senegal to Chad, from Côte d'Ivoire to Burkina Faso. This colonial rule left an indelible mark on the continent, a mark that, in many ways, is still visible today. The scars of colonization have shaped Africa's political, economic, and social structures, and France's influence has remained long after the formal end of colonialism. When we think about French colonialism, we must remember that it wasn't just about territorial control. It was about control of resources, people, and culture. France extracted valuable minerals, crops, and labor from its colonies, all while imposing a European way of life on the African population. It was a brutal system that sought to strip away African identities and replace them with French ideals. Education, religion, politics, and even language were all used as tools of assimilation. French was not just a language, it became the language of power, a tool that reinforced the dominance of the colonizer. However, the so-called freedom that came with the independence of African nations in the 1960s did not mark the end of French influence. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter of control, a chapter that many would argue is still being written today. Even after the formal colonial era ended, France maintained a tight grip on its former colonies through a series of agreements, both covert and overt. These agreements tied African economies to France in a way that made true independence nearly impossible. One of the most significant aspects of this continued influence was the currency used by many of France's former colonies in West and Central Africa, the CFA franc. Introduced in the early days of colonial rule, the CFA franc remains in use today in 14 African countries. What most people don't realize, however, is that the CFA franc is controlled by the French treasury, meaning that these African nations do not have full control over their own economies. The French government holds reserves of this currency in Paris, and African countries must deposit a significant portion of their foreign reserves into French banks. This system is often referred to as financial colonialism, and it is a stark reminder that Africa's so-called independence has often been undermined by financial and economic dependence on France. The French military presence in Africa is another enduring legacy of colonialism. After the end of the colonial era, France made sure to maintain a military presence across the continent, positioning its troops in key countries and establishing military bases that still exist today. The French military has been involved in numerous interventions, often justified by the need to combat terrorism or stabilize fragile states. But the truth, as many critics argue, is that these military interventions have frequently served to maintain France's influence over the political landscape of African nations. French troops have been accused of propping up corrupt regimes and supporting governments that are friendly to French economic interests, often at the expense of the African people. In Burkina Faso, as well as in many other countries across Africa, the French military presence has long been a point of contention. The people of Burkina Faso have witnessed firsthand how the French military has been more focused on protecting its own interests than on securing the safety and well-being of the local population. And as Burkina Faso grapples with growing insurgencies and instability in the Sahel region, many have started to question the role of France and its continued military presence. How can a country truly be sovereign if its military is dictated by a foreign power? For years, many African leaders have voiced their frustration with France's continued influence. But the challenge has been how to break free from these ties. The overwhelming power that France wields, politically, economically, and militarily, has made it difficult for African countries to chart their own course. And this is where Ibrahim Traoré's rise becomes so significant. His rejection of France's military presence in Burkina Faso was not just an act of political defiance. It was a powerful statement about sovereignty. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso, and by extension, Africa, would no longer accept a situation where foreign powers dictate their future. Traoré's decision to expel French troops from Burkina Faso sent shockwaves across Africa and Europe. It was a bold move that made it clear. The era of unquestioning subservience to former colonial masters was over. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was a moment of empowerment, a moment when they could stand tall and say, "We control our own destiny." It was a message to the broader African continent that breaking free from the shackles of colonialism isn't just about political independence. It's about economic freedom, military autonomy, and the ability to make decisions that serve the needs of the people, not foreign interests. But while Traoré's actions are certainly radical, they are also deeply rooted in a wider movement of African nations seeking to regain their independence, not just from political domination, but from the economic and military control that has been exerted for generations. The rise of leaders like Traoré signals a powerful shift, a shift from passive acceptance to active resistance. Africa is waking up, and with each move, with each leader who dares to stand against foreign influence, the continent is asserting its rightful place in the world. The legacy of French influence in Africa is undeniable, but it is also a legacy that is slowly being dismantled. Each time a leader like Ibrahim Traoré rises up and challenges the status quo, it weakens the hold that colonial powers once had on the continent. It is a reminder that true independence is not just about gaining political control. It is about having the power to make choices that serve the interests of the people, not the powers that once sought to control them. Ibrahim Traoré's meteoric rise to power is not merely the story of an individual leader, but the embodiment of a continent awakening from centuries of oppression. The challenge that Traoré represents to France is not just political. It is symbolic of a deeper, long overdue reckoning with the colonial past and its ongoing grip on African nations. His leadership comes at a time when the African people, particularly in the Sahel region, are increasingly tired of foreign interference, and they are demanding sovereignty and self-determination like never before. When Traoré came to power in September 2022, Burkina Faso was in crisis. The country was plagued by escalating jihadist violence, with entire regions falling under the control of extremist groups. The government, under former President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, had been unable to provide the security the people so desperately needed. Traoré, then a young army captain, led a military coup that ousted Kabore and took control of the country's leadership. But what set Traoré apart from many other military leaders in Africa was his vision, his boldness, and his deep understanding of the forces at play, both within Burkina Faso and the larger geopolitical landscape. From the outset, it became clear that Traoré was not content to simply rule through force. His coup wasn't just about replacing one government with another. It was about transforming Burkina Faso's relationship with the outside world, particularly with former colonial powers like France. Traoré's rise was not just a response to internal issues. It was a deliberate, calculated effort to assert the country's sovereignty in the face of overwhelming external pressure. Perhaps the most significant and symbolic act of defiance Traoré made was his decision to expel the French military from Burkina Faso. France had maintained a military presence in the country as part of its broader intervention in the Sahel region. For years, France had justified its military presence in countries like Burkina Faso under the guise of combating terrorism and ensuring regional stability. Yet, for many Africans, this presence felt less like a partnership and more like a continuation of colonial domination, a form of modern-day imperialism. French troops were stationed in Burkina Faso, ostensibly to help with security efforts, but they were also deeply involved in the political and economic affairs of the country. In essence, they were seen as a reminder of Africa's historical subjugation. For Traoré, this military presence was no longer tolerable. In his eyes, the French troops were not there to protect Burkina Faso's interests. They were there to protect France's interests. His decision to expel them was an act of reclaiming control. It wasn't just a military or political maneuver. It was a statement of sovereignty. He was saying, "We will no longer tolerate foreign forces telling us how to live, how to govern, and how to protect ourselves." His bold action sent shockwaves across the continent, and it was seen by many as a rallying cry for other African nations who had long struggled under the weight of colonial legacies. But the challenge to France didn't end with the expulsion of its troops. Traoré's actions were a direct challenge to the global order that had been dominated by former colonial powers for centuries. His stance represented a rejection of the global economic systems that continue to favor the West, often at the expense of African nations. For decades, France has held substantial economic power over its former colonies, including through the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African countries that is still controlled by the French government. Traoré's decision to reject France's military influence was, in many ways, the first step in dismantling the financial ties that have bound African countries to the French economy. But Ibrahim Traoré's rise is about more than just removing French influence from Burkina Faso. It is part of a larger movement across the African continent, one that is seeking to dismantle the neo-colonial structures that have perpetuated poverty, instability, and inequality in Africa for decades. The rise of leaders like Traoré represents the growing power of African youth, the generation that is no longer willing to accept the status quo. These are leaders who understand the importance of sovereignty, of economic independence, and of reclaiming their country's rightful place in the world. Traoré's defiance is not just against France. It is against a system that has long kept African nations at the mercy of foreign powers. It is a challenge to the structures that have undermined Africa's potential for far too long. But the significance of his rise goes beyond his personal political victory. His leadership is emblematic of the growing African Renaissance, one where the continent is no longer willing to be a passive player in global affairs. Instead, it is taking control of its own destiny, and leaders like Traoré are showing the world that Africa will not wait for permission to rise. The challenge Traoré presents to France's power is not just about military tactics or political strategies. It is about a vision for a new Africa, an Africa that is free from the vestiges of colonial control, an Africa that is united, sovereign, and able to make its own decisions. His defiance is a reminder that power is not just about military might or economic influence. It is about the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity, to challenge the systems that seek to keep us oppressed, and to fight for a better future. Traoré's rise is an invitation for Africans everywhere to take charge of their future, to reject the false narratives that have been imposed upon them, and to chart a course toward true independence. The challenge to France's power is not just a political challenge. It is a call to action for all Africans to stand up and demand the respect, dignity, and sovereignty they deserve. It is a movement that says, we will no longer be silent. We will no longer be controlled. We will take our future into our own hands. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré is not the end of a struggle. It is the beginning of a new chapter in Africa's story. It is a chapter where the continent's voice will no longer be silenced, where its people will no longer accept being dictated to by foreign powers. It is a chapter where Africa, with leaders like Traoré at the forefront, will rise and take its place as a powerful force on the global stage. The challenge to France's power is just the beginning of a larger, global movement, one that seeks to restore Africa's dignity, sovereignty, and pride. The expulsion of French troops from Burkina Faso was a pivotal moment, not just for the country, but for the entire continent of Africa. For Ibrahim Traoré and his supporters, this was a monumental victory, one that symbolized Africa's refusal to be controlled by external powers. However, the response from France and its allies was swift and filled with resistance. What followed was a tense diplomatic standoff, a tug-of-war for influence, and a glaring reminder of the deep-rooted, often uncomfortable relationship between African nations and their former colonial powers. In the days after Traoré's announcement, France's reaction was one of defiance and condemnation. French officials, including President Emmanuel Macron, made it clear that they would not accept the expulsion of their forces without repercussions. France, with its long history in Africa, had no intention of relinquishing its grip on the continent so easily. The French government labeled Traoré's move as dangerous and irresponsible, framing it as a destabilizing action that would harm not only Burkina Faso, but the wider region. France's military presence in the Sahel, they argued, was essential to combat the rising threat of extremist groups in the region. However, this response revealed something deeper. It highlighted the colonial mindset that continues to pervade French foreign policy in Africa, a mindset that views African countries as pawns in a larger geopolitical game, rather than as sovereign nations with the right to determine their own futures. France's refusal to accept Traoré's decision was not just about the military presence. It was about control, about maintaining a position of dominance, and about preserving the status quo. For France, the expulsion wasn't just a loss of military personnel. It was the loss of influence, the loss of a centuries-old foothold in a region they had long considered their own. For many in Africa, however, the French response was predictable, if not entirely unsurprising. France's post-colonial behavior has often been one of paternalism and dominance, whether through political interference, military presence, or economic control. The French government's refusal to accept the will of the Burkinabe people is a stark reminder of the neo-colonial systems that still bind many African nations to their former colonizers. The very fact that France felt entitled to challenge a sovereign nation's right to control its own military presence speaks volumes about the imbalanced power dynamics at play. But it wasn't just the French government that reacted negatively. Traoré's move also sparked fierce debates among African leaders and the international community. Many of France's allies in the region, particularly in the European Union, rallied behind France, criticizing the expulsion as a dangerous precedent that could destabilize the region further. These powers voiced concerns over the potential for increased jihadist activity in the Sahel, warning that the absence of French forces could lead to a power vacuum and further chaos. Yet, this perspective, though valid in the eyes of some, is part of the broader narrative that Africa has often had to endure. The idea that its people and leaders are incapable of handling their own security or governance. For too long, foreign powers have positioned themselves as the saviors of Africa, stepping in to help in times of crisis, but often without regard for the true needs and desires of the African people. The belief that Africa needs foreign intervention to maintain peace and stability is an outdated and patronizing narrative, a narrative that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are challenging with each bold step they take. Traoré's decision to expel the French troops was, in essence, a declaration of self-reliance, a message that Burkina Faso, and by extension, Africa, would no longer rely on foreign powers to dictate its path. But as with all acts of defiance, it comes at a price. The growing tensions between France and Burkina Faso are not just about military strategy. They are about power, identity, and sovereignty. It is a battle for control over the future of Africa, and it is a battle that will be fought on multiple fronts. The tensions between France and Burkina Faso are part of a larger global conversation about power and sovereignty. Traoré's rise represents a new Africa, an Africa that refuses to be marginalized, that demands to be seen as an equal player on the world stage. His challenge to France's power is symbolic of the broader resistance against colonialism that is sweeping across the continent. It is a movement that says Africa will no longer tolerate being viewed as a resource to be exploited, a region to be controlled, or a people to be kept in perpetual dependency. But the struggle for true independence is not without its challenges. France's influence in Africa runs deep, and the response to Traoré's actions is just one example of the lengths to which former colonial powers are willing to go to maintain their dominance. France has historically used both hard power, through military intervention, and soft power, through economic leverage and diplomatic channels, to shape African politics. The growing tensions between France and Burkina Faso signal that the old ways of doing business are being challenged, and that a new era of African sovereignty is emerging. For the people of Burkina Faso, the challenge is clear. Will they stand firm in the face of external pressure, or will they allow the legacy of colonialism to continue to dictate their future? Ibrahim Traoré's bold stand has already proven that he is not afraid to take on one of the most powerful nations in the world, but the path ahead will be fraught with challenges. The growing tensions between France and Burkina Faso will not be resolved overnight. They are part of a larger struggle for Africa's future, one that will take time, effort, and unity to overcome. The rising tensions are a reminder to all of us that the fight for sovereignty and dignity is never easy, but it is always worth it. Traoré's defiance is not just about Burkina Faso, it is about Africa as a whole. It is a challenge to all Africans to stand up, to reject the forces that seek to control them, and to fight for the future they deserve. It is a call to action that reminds us all that true independence is not just about the absence of foreign troops on our soil. It is about the ability to make decisions for ourselves, to control our destiny, and to stand tall as equals in a world that too often seeks to keep us down. The growing tensions between France and Burkina Faso are a powerful reminder that the struggle for African sovereignty is far from over. But they also signal a new dawn for the continent, a dawn in which African nations are no longer willing to be subjugated. It is a moment to reflect, to ask ourselves, What kind of Africa do we want to build? One that is defined by foreign control, or one that is shaped by the will and strength of its own people? The stakes in the growing tensions between Burkina Faso and France are far greater than a bilateral dispute. This is a battle that has deep, wide-reaching implications for the entire African continent, and indeed, the world. As Ibrahim Traoré's challenge to French power continues to unfold, it's crucial to understand the geopolitical stakes at play, not only for Africa, but also for the global balance of power. The events taking place in Burkina Faso are part of a larger shift, one that has the potential to reshape the way nations interact, to redefine alliances, and to alter the course of history. For centuries, Africa has been the site of external influence, intervention, and exploitation. From colonialism to the Cold War and beyond, global powers have viewed Africa primarily as a resource, a land of minerals, labor, and geopolitical maneuvering. However, as we enter the 21st century, the world is beginning to change, and with it, Africa's role in global affairs. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are part of a broader movement pushing for Africa to assert its rightful place on the world stage, no longer as a passive participant, but as a force to be reckoned with. At the heart of this geopolitical shift is the question of sovereignty. The challenge that Burkina Faso presents to France is not just about a specific country rejecting a foreign power. It is about the broader principle of self-determination and control over one's own destiny. If Burkina Faso can break free from the influence of its former colonial master, it sends a message to the rest of Africa that it is possible to stand up against the forces that have long sought to dictate the continent's future. This message is not just important for African countries, it has global ramifications. For the West, particularly France and its allies, the geopolitical stakes are enormous. The Sahel region, which includes Burkina Faso, is of immense strategic importance. It is located at the crossroads of Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and it has become a hotbed for extremism, organized crime, and instability. For years, France and its European partners have positioned themselves as the protectors of regional stability, sending troops and resources to the Sahel to fight insurgents and combat terrorism. But the question that arises is, at what cost? For France, maintaining influence in this region is not just about security. It is about preserving its legacy, its interests, and its control over a part of the world that has historically been under its thumb. The growing resistance to France's presence in the region threatens to undermine this control. If Burkina Faso's defiance sparks a broader movement across the continent, it could disrupt Western geopolitical objectives in Africa. This is not merely about military presence. It's about the control of resources, economic power, and the shaping of political alliances. The Sahel, rich in natural resources like gold, uranium, and oil, has long been a key area of interest for global powers, particularly France. The question that now arises is whether these resources will continue to flow into the hands of former colonial powers, or whether African nations will be able to reclaim them for their own benefit. But the geopolitical stakes are not just about Western powers. China has increasingly become a major player in Africa, and its growing influence in the continent is one of the most significant developments of the 21st century. China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured billions of dollars into infrastructure projects across Africa, offering an alternative to Western aid and investment. For China, Africa is not just a source of resources. It is a critical strategic partner in its quest to reshape the global order. As African nations begin to assert their sovereignty and challenge Western influence, China stands ready to offer its support, often without the political strings attached that come with Western aid. In this context, Burkina Faso's defiance of France can be seen as part of a larger geopolitical shift toward multipolarity, where countries are no longer bound by the traditional influence of the West, but instead have the opportunity to chart their own course, form new alliances, and open up new avenues for growth and development. If Burkina Faso and other African nations succeed in their efforts to assert independence from former colonial powers, it could signal the dawn of a new era in global politics, one where Africa's voice is stronger and its influence is felt far beyond its borders. The stakes are also high for France and its allies within Europe. France has long viewed its relationship with Africa as a cornerstone of its global influence. The country has a network of military bases across the continent, deep ties with political elites, and a heavy economic footprint in former colonies. France's influence in Africa has been one of the key pillars of its geopolitical power in the post-colonial era. But the rise of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré threatens to undo this influence, forcing France to reevaluate its role in Africa. France is already facing increasing isolation within Europe over its foreign policy and its approach to global leadership. Losing its grip on Africa would deal a significant blow to its stature on the world stage. For the African continent, the geopolitical stakes are about more than just challenging a former colonial power. They are about redefining what it means to be a sovereign, independent continent in the modern world. As Africa begins to rise, it faces the challenge of navigating complex relationships with both the West and China, balancing economic opportunities with political autonomy. The rising tension between Burkina Faso and France is an indicator that the old global order is no longer sustainable, and that Africa is beginning to take control of its own destiny. The consequences of this shift will not be felt overnight, but the growing influence of African nations on the global stage is undeniable. As leaders like Ibrahim Traoré continue to assert their sovereignty and reject foreign control, they are laying the groundwork for a future where Africa is no longer seen as a passive recipient of foreign intervention, but as an active participant in shaping the global order. The geopolitical stakes, therefore, are not just about military control or economic dominance. They are about creating a world where all nations, regardless of their past, have the power to decide their own future. The tension between Burkina Faso and France is only the beginning. The broader implications of this standoff will continue to reverberate across Africa and the world. The stakes are high, but the opportunity is even greater. Africa's future is in its own hands now, and leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are showing the world that the continent is ready to rise, ready to take its place as an equal in the global arena. As the world watches closely, one thing is clear. Ibrahim Traoré's bold stand is not just a challenge to France. It's a challenge to the entire world order, a challenge to the legacy of colonialism, and a call for Africa's true independence and sovereignty. The future of Burkina Faso and the broader African continent is being rewritten in real time. What happens next will be pivotal, not just for Africa, but for global geopolitics. Will the winds of change sweep across the continent, or will old powers manage to reassert their control? Only time will tell.